Hey guys, Will here. So today we're taking a look at the Prosimu T1000 3M SV Motion Cockpit.
T1000.
What the hell does that mean?
Now this is a fully integrated system, comes with 3 axes of motion, and they make some pretty bold claims in their marketing. It says, never lose traction ever again, stay in control of your vehicle at all times. Now, obviously, no sim rig is going to stop you from ever losing traction, and if it could, it wouldn't need to have a traction loss system built into it in the first place. But silly marketing speak aside, this thing is actually pretty darn impressive. So we're going to be putting through its paces today, taking you through all the things that I think you need to know to help decide whether this might be the motion rig for you. So let's get into it.
Listen to me very carefully.
Okay, so we do have quite a bit to get through in today's video. Firstly, a big thank you to Prosimu for sending across this rig for us to check out. Now, we will be cross-comparing this against the experience using a variety of different types of motion systems in today's video to try and give you as accurate a picture as possible as what kind of system is going to suit you best, because they're not all made the same and they all do achieve different things. So everything that we're going to be covering today is just purely my own observations and my own opinions of all of these various different products that we've tested. Now, we don't have any sort of affiliate link at the time of filming this for Prosimu, but if you do end up having any discount codes or anything like that, I will put them down in the description box below for you. But if you are after any of the other products that we talk about in today's video or any other sim racing gear, we do have a bunch of affiliate links and discount codes available for you guys. That is an awesome way of helping support the channel at no additional cost to you. So we really do appreciate your support there. But without further ado, let's get into the review of the Prosimu T1000. So as I touched on in the intro, this is a fully integrated sim rig. All you need to do is just some minor assembly when you receive it, and then obviously mount your wheelbase, your pedals, your steering wheel, your shifter, your handbrake, or whatever other bits and pieces that you might want to bolt onto the rig. But otherwise it is fully integrated. So the motion forms a part of the actual rig and it all just kind of goes together very cleanly. It does have a very small footprint as well. But yeah, just to give you a baseline here in terms of price, there are quite a few different configurations available for this depending on what you want. And I'll make a couple of recommendations here just based on my experience with this particular setup as we get through today's video as well. But the rig, as you see spec'd here with 3 degrees of freedom and the seat included, comes in at €5,040 or thereabouts. Obviously you do need to factor in local shipping, taxes and duties, all those kinds of things. So just make sure you do shop around, make sure you're getting the best possible deal there and that there's not going to be any hidden costs or surprises involved. But as I mentioned, there are quite a few different ways that you can configure this. There is also a steel version of the cockpit available too, as opposed to the aluminium profile version that we have here. Now, I haven't got any experience with that, so I can't unfortunately make any comparisons between the two, but this does look, at least on paper and in photographs, like it probably will be the more sturdy of the two. But if you do own one of the other ones, or you've had the experience of both of them, please do comment down below and let us know what some of the differences are in your opinion. So just throwing out a price like that, it does sound quite expensive, but we need to put this in the correct context here. So just a couple of other comparisons. This is by no means all exhaustive. This is just a couple of other systems that we've tested here at Boosted Media. So something like the Next Level Racing Motion Platform V3 seat mover, which only moves the seat, doesn't move the whole cockpit like this. That comes in at around about €3,000. Something like the Next Level Racing Traction Plus, for example, that comes in at €5,400 or thereabouts. And that only gives you front and rear traction loss. So it's kind of like a sway and yaw rather than having pitch and roll like what we have on this one in addition to yaw. So that is already more expensive than what this entire cockpit is. And then you would have the additional cost of a cockpit and any other motion that you wanted to bolt on top of that as well. The Next Level Racing Motion Plus, which is commonly actually combined with the Traction Plus, that on its own comes in at around about the €3,000 mark just for the 2 actuator system. And that does only give you pitch and roll. If you want to add heave to that for 3DOF, you're looking at pretty much doubling the cost for a second system to integrate with that to give you front and rear actuators. So quite a lot more expensive there again. And again, that doesn't include the cost of a cockpit or any other peripherals on top of that either. We then have the old faithful D-Box G5, which comes in around about €7,200 for the 4 actuator system. And interestingly, as we get into the more technical stuff throughout today's video, you'll see that the specs on the actuators used on this Prosimu rig are actually more impressive in many ways, at least on paper, than what they are on the D-Box. So that's going to be an interesting thing to stick around for later on. We then got systems like the Qubic Systems QS210, which we're in the process of reviewing at the moment. That comes in a little bit over €5,500 or thereabouts. And then we have something like the Sigma Integrale Integrale DK2 3 actuator system, which comes in at €4,000, or the 4 actuator system, which comes in a little bit over €5,500 once again. So you can see this kind of sits smack bang in the middle, but out of all of the options that we saw there, this is the only one that gives you traction loss at around that kind of price. Although some of them are 3 degrees of freedom, all those previous systems that we mentioned, with the exception of just the Traction Plus, of course, are all only pitch and roll, and in some cases heave. So none of them are going to have that yaw effect unless you add some sort of traction platform on top of it. So that's not an all exhaustive list by any means, but yeah, just to give you an example of where this kind of sits in the market overall. So hopefully that illustrates for you that even though it is expensive, and there's no way around that, unfortunately motion systems just are inherently expensive. For what you're actually getting for your money, I think it is actually pretty reasonable value. Just be aware that there are occasionally some deals going with some of these other systems. I can remember, for example, I'm not sure if it's still running now, but SimLab, for example, had a deal where if you bought a D-Box G5, you actually got a P1X cockpit included in that price. So just make sure you're shopping around, make sure you're doing your due diligence there and making sure you're not missing out on any potential good deals. But yeah, in my opinion, having tested all of those systems that we just mentioned now, I think the price that they're asking for this is fair. So what are you actually getting for the money here? So this is a 3 DOF, or 3 degrees of freedom motion platform. So you've got 2 actuators in the front, you've got a balance bar, or a fulcrum, I guess you could call it, in the back here, and then you've got another actuator, which you can see down in the middle here, which is responsible for the traction loss. So the 2 actuators on the front here give you pitch and roll, so it allows the platform to move up and down, as you can see here, and then from side to side, obvious as well. So you don't get the same heave effect that you get with a traditional 4 or 3 actuator system, which allows the rig to actually raise up and down. That does give you a greater sense of like undulation on the circuit. Just to give you an example, a couple of things that I love to do to test out a motion rig is one, driving through a rouge where you come down that big dip, you feel that compression in the car, and also the big crest that you have coming down the first straight on the Bathurst circuit as well. You come over a crest and you really kind of feel the car lift up underneath you in a rig that has a heave effect. So that is missing to an extent on a system like this. These are the kinds of things that you're omitting or doing away with a 2 actuator system as opposed to a 4. So you've still got pitch and roll effect, and look, because you can still raise and lower the front to give you the pitch sensation, it can still simulate that feeling of moving up and down to an extent, but it's just not quite the same as having true heave. So that's how it achieves its pitch and roll, and then the back here is able to slide from side to side as well to achieve yaw. Now it's important that you understand the difference between yaw and sway. Yaw is where the rig is basically just pivoting around a fixed point at the front. Sway, on the other hand, is where the entire rig is able to twist. So the front can move one way while the back moves the other way, and you might see the entire rig kind of slide from side to side as well. And that's what the Next Level Racing Traction Plus is able to do. We'll get into what that actually means for the driving experience later on when we talk about driving in general. Now the actuators themselves actually really surprise me. These things are insanely powerful, particularly when you consider their size. So these are actually the weakest ones available. These are the PRS 50 actuators. These have 100 millimeters of travel. You can then step up to the Black series, or the PRS 200 series. That is available in a 100 mil travel, just the same as what we have here, a 150 or a 200 mil travel if you want to have that extra throw. Now look, honestly, I tend to be of the school of thought that less is more when it comes to motion, at least to an extent. What you want is responsiveness, sharpness, and low latency, rather than having a huge amount of movement, because the more you're kind of moving, the more return to center effect you're going to have, and that's going to start to get to the point where the car starts to feel a little bit disconnected from reality, at least in my experience and my opinion. You might feel differently about that, and different rigs achieve their effects in different ways as well. So for example, with the V20 rig that we have been doing a couple of videos and still have to do a full review on, which will be coming soon, that I actually didn't feel like that was quite such an issue. I don't mind having a bit more movement on that particular rig, but something like this, and also with the D-Box, the Sigma Integrale, and you know, all these kind of 4 or 3 or 2 actuator type systems, less tends to be more, at least in my experience. So yeah, I mean, I haven't tested the Black series, so I can't speak to the differences, but I can tell you that I would be absolutely satisfied with this if I bought this one. And you can see in some of this footage just how violent this thing is. In fact, I didn't unfortunately get it on camera, but at one point I had the settings completely wrong for WRC, and the thing actually pogoed right up on its side. It tipped over and almost actually tipped completely over. It stood right up on its side. It was absolutely insane. And you can see how when you crank things up, the whole thing actually slides around on the carpet. So yeah, it's capable of some absolutely crazy things. But these are able to achieve a maximum velocity of 200 millimeters per second. Now, of course, the actuators themselves only actually have 100 millimeters of travel. So it's important that you understand a couple of things here. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's able to travel its full distance in half a second, as you might think from those specs. What it means is that at its maximum velocity, so once that maximum speed has already been reached, that's the speed in which it can go. So there's a couple of specs here I want to run through and some comparisons. So the D-Box G5 by comparison, that is running at 100 millimeters per second, so half the maximum velocity than what we have here. The Sigma DK2 is 200 millimeters per second, so same as what we have here. The Qubic QS210, that guy comes in at 400 millimeters per second, but importantly, its acceleration is 0.6 G, whereas the Prosimu, what we have here, they're claiming 1 G. So what that means is that even though the maximum speed might be a little bit lower, the acceleration is a lot faster. One other important spec that you need to be aware of is that they do spec a driver weight of 150 kilograms on their spec sheet. Now, that's a little bit unclear. I'm not 100% certain on this. It might be something you might want to clarify if you're looking at buying one of these, but I don't know whether that actually means the full payload weight or whether that does literally mean the weight of the driver, because obviously they don't know how much your pedals are going to weigh. They don't know how much your wheelbase. They don't know whether you're going to have button boxes, shifters, handbrakes, all those kinds of appendages on your rig. They don't know whether you're going to be running integrated monitors or a free monitor stand, for example, as well, although they do actually have a freestanding monitor option available, which we unfortunately don't have here to test. But yeah, I'm not 100% clear, even though the website does say driver weight, it may actually mean payload capacity. So yeah, in terms of construction and design, it is actually a pretty simple system overall, although it does look very complex. You've got your two actuators at the front, which are responsible for your roll and pitch. You've got the balance bar or the fulcrum at the back, which allows it to rock front to back and side to side. And then you've got the actuator on the back that allows it to slide for the traction loss effect. And then essentially it's just an aluminium profile rig that is sitting on top of that platform. So let's run through the details of that now. There are a couple of important things that I do think you need to be aware of here in terms of who this may or may not be suitable for. So let's get into that detail now. So the first thing that I noticed with this rig once we got the seat mounted is that it is relatively short. Now, for me, being 6 foot tall, so not massive, it is right on the limit of what I'm able to drive with, simply because you can see here, I've got the seat pushed pretty far back here. And then the wheel deck is pretty much all the way to the front before we actually reverse these uprights around and face them the other direction. So that wheel deck is pretty much as far back as it can go. And as you can see in the driving footage, it is actually a little bit on the cramped side for me. I would actually prefer to have the wheel maybe an inch, maybe half an inch further away from me. So it will obviously depend on the wheelbase that you're using, how long your quick release and your stem is on the wheel as well. All those things are always going to be a factor on any rig, but I do find with this particular configuration, it is a little tiny bit cramped for me. Pedal adjustment wise, not too bad. You can see we do have a front and rear adjustment here. So you can both tilt the pedals up and down and move them closer or further away from you. But again, we do actually have that pedal tray absolutely maxed out in terms of how far away it can be from me, and the seat pretty much as far back as it can be as well before things start to get crazy. You can imagine if we go any further back than this, because when I'm pushing on the brake, all my weight is going into the back of the seat. If there's no supporting structure underneath it, it does start to introduce some flex. So you really can't go any further back than what we have it here before you start to have to make other compromises. So yeah, I am literally right on the limit, not only in terms of my wheel deck placement, but also in the length of my legs, the distance between the pedal face and the seat of the pants. So yeah, that did surprise me a little bit. Of course, it does come with the benefit of having a smaller footprint overall, and I'll put the footprint dimensions up on the screen for you now so you can see for yourselves. I do really like the fact that it has a small profile, particularly for a fully integrated motion rig like this. Often they do take up a lot of space and they can be really, really heavy to move around as well. This thing actually does slide around quite easily on carpet, which can be quite practical in many scenarios. But yeah, the downside of that is that if you are taller than about 6 foot, you may start to run into a couple of issues. There are a couple of little bits and pieces with the rig as well. Just a couple of things in terms of the design. It is quite awkward to loosen some of the bolts which are around here to slide the tray forward and back, simply because when you're up against the profile on the uprights, you can't really get an Allen key in there to loosen it. So you kind of end up having to loosen a lot of other areas just to get to the one thing that you want to move. One other thing that we did have to do was adjust the position of the rig front to rear across the balance bar and the supporting structure underneath the actuators. Because my weight was so far back, every time I accelerated and the actuators lifted up, the entire rig was trying to do a wheelie, and it was actually quite scary. So we got that sorted out by just shifting the weight profile and making sure that was all lined up correctly. Now the wheel deck is quite interesting as well. As you can see, it places the wheelbase quite far forward relative to the uprights, and you do have a little bit of adjustment. You can see there are little slots underneath here that allow you to slide it front and rear and tilt it to an extent. But you can see back here, if you try to tilt the wheelbase up too much, you do end up smacking into the profile. So that means you have to move everything a little bit further forward again to get any more tilt out of it. They don't have a front mount option available either. So if you do have a wheelbase like a Simucube 2 or a VRS, for example, that don't have bottom mount holes, you will need to have some sort of a front mount bracket, which you can bolt onto this guy. Not too much of a deal breaker there, I don't think, but just something to be aware of, maybe an additional cost if you have one of the wheelbases that requires a front mount. But yeah, look, I mean, this thing is pretty sturdy. You can see here, no major issues with flex or anything like that. And overall, the rig is very solidly designed. And yeah, didn't have any major complaints. The only area where I really perceived any flex at all when driving is just a little bit of wobble in the shifter mount, because there isn't an upright that secures it to the bottom of the frame here. There just is a little bit of movement there. But look, when you're in the experience of driving and everything's moving around and thrashing you about, little bits of flex here and there aren't really noticeable, to be honest with you anyway. So yeah, I'm absolutely happy with the rigidity of the rig overall. The only thing just to be aware of is that the type of profile they're using here isn't like profile that I've seen from any other major cockpit manufacturer. So your Track Racer, your SimLab, and the like, Advanced Sim Racing as well. So that did mean that some of the T-nuts that we had just laying around from some of those other rigs weren't compatible with what we had here. And they didn't include any additional T-nuts at all. So I would like to see them include just a little bag of, maybe 5 or 6 of, M5, M6, and M8 T-nuts, just so you don't get caught out if you're trying to mount some accessories when you get this guy home. But yeah, just be aware of the adjustment limitations there if you are a bigger person. As I said before, I'm 6 foot tall, and it was right on the limit for me. Any taller, and I think I would have struggled with it. And ideally, I would like to have the wheel a little bit further away from me than what was possible without sort of reconfiguring things. And even then, the pedals really just can't physically be any further away without some sort of a fabricated tray. Now, just quickly with regards to the seat as well, I was really impressed with this seat. It's got this really nice padding in it. You can see when you get up close on it, it's got this pattern, and there's sort of like a springy effect in there, kind of creates that air cushion. So yeah, I did find it to be very comfortable. No issues with flex or the back popping out under braking or any crazy stuff like that, like we've seen with some other seats in the past. Personally, I'm not a big fan of these parts simply because they do make you feel a little bit claustrophobic under some circumstances, but I mean, that's just purely a subjective thing. Some people might really like the realism that's provided by that, but in a simulator, you don't really need support for your neck like that, so it is superfluous. But for realism, you might love it. Personally, I could do away with it and I'd be absolutely fine, but otherwise, absolutely no complaints about the seat whatsoever. Nice and solid, nice and comfortable, plenty of ventilation as well, and yeah, no complaints at all. So around the other side of the rig now, just a couple of quick things that I wanted to cover off. Firstly, the handbrake mount. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is an optional accessory, so you don't need to buy their handbrake mount even. It is obviously just standard aluminium profile here, so you can use any mount that you want to, but look, this one is sturdy enough. There's a little bit of flex there. And again, as I was saying before, when everything's moving around with the motion and everything, you don't tend to notice little bits of flex there at all. But if a little bit of flex there does bother you, there are other ways to mount your handbrake. As you can see, we do have the shifter just bolted directly to the profile here as well. And you can see the lack of that support arm that I was mentioning earlier, which would just make it a little bit more sturdy. You can see the emergency stop button mounted down there as well. Now, that ships with a long bolt on the back of it poking through. There's not really a convenient place anywhere else on the rig that I could think of to really mount that. So yeah, it was a bit of an interesting design choice there, but I think that's a pretty good location for it anyway. It means you're not having to reach past the wheel or any other potentially moving parts to get to it. And as I said, I have had to hit it a couple of times, and yeah, it's been absolutely fine. So that seems to be a pretty decent place for it. Look, otherwise, yeah, just wanted to run you through cable management and of course the control box here as well. Now, a lot of motion rigs are quite clumsy when it comes to their control modules. My favorite one is actually the older D-Box G3, which actually integrates it underneath the rig. And I got mine through SimLab, along with a kit that actually integrates it into the P1X chassis. So the control modules, it actually comes with 2 big modules, master and slave module, and they integrate into the actual chassis with some plates, so you don't even see them. And that works really cleanly for me. But this I'm also a big fan of. So what they've done is, rather than having an awkward box that you've got to kind of find a place for it somewhere around the rig, they've made it the size and strength that it needs to be to fit a PC sitting on top of it. So as you can see, this is an open frame PC. Most people aren't going to have something like this, but a standard ATX case will sit on top of this, absolutely no issues. It gets your PC up off the ground as well, which is good for dust and ventilation. And yeah, I just think it's a pretty clean way of doing it. So on the back of the box here, you can see the various different inputs and outputs. So we've got a standard IEC power connection here with a power switch. Now in the literature, it does say that the module module is compatible with 110 to 240 volts, but it does also mention in the documentation that you may need a power transformer depending on where you live in the world. So I'm not 100% certain exactly what's going on there, but I was able to just plug this straight into 240 volts here in Australia, and there wasn't any smoke or flames or sparks, so I guess it's all good. Yeah, so just a standard IEC power cable. You then got 2 USB connections here as well, so you will require 2 free USB ports on your PC. They don't recommend that you run it through a hub, so yeah, you will want to have it relatively close to your PC. Nice and convenient if you sit your PC on top of the box. Not a huge fan of the fact that these cables do actually pass into the box, so you can't just easily replace the cable if you do damage one, but it's probably going to be sitting in place and not really be at too much risk anyway. Likewise with the cables that run to each of the actuators as well, those are hardwired in. You've got 3 thick cables here which distribute power to each one of the 3 actuators, and then the control cables as well for all of the data transmission. So yeah, look, in terms of cable management, relatively simple. The cables are long enough that you can get the box to pretty much anywhere you might want it to be. It would be nice if they include some cable management clips or cable straps or ties. We just use some standard cable ties just to tidy things up. And it's literally just 2 plugs for each actuator, so 6 plugs in total. Power plug, USB cables, and installing the software, and you're pretty much good to go. Just want to quickly show you the keyboard tray as well. Now this is an optional accessory. I'll put the price up on the screen for you now. And look, I actually really like this. I might actually end up using it on my daily driver rig. You've got a bit of adjustment up and down here, so you can raise it and lower it depending on the height of your platform. So if you end up adding extra actuators or extra paraphernalia to your rig, you can raise it up. It's got a nice little retainer here as well for the keyboard, so you can slide that in and out to match the size of your keyboard. Relatively sturdy little mouse pad here as well. It is all steel construction, and yeah, it does the job quite nicely. One of the better ones that I've seen over the years here. So yeah, if you're in the market for a keyboard and mouse standalone system like this, you can definitely say that this is a good option as well. But back to the more important thing again, the rig now. Let's I think that's everything that we need to cover in terms of the build and the cockpit itself. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below and I'm happy to answer those. But why don't we get into the driving experience now, talk about software and how we actually get this thing running. So onto the driving experience and what this thing is actually like to use and operate day to day. Now, a big part of that story is of course the software, and this rig is using SimTools V3. Now, when you purchase one of these rigs, you're granted a license for the SimTools software, which unlocks special repositories for the profiles built specifically for these rigs. So obviously, depending on the rig you buy will determine which profiles you get access to. And the reason why I mention that is because the experience that you have with this rig is going to vary greatly depending on which profiles you're trying to use. So you can see on the screen here the profiles which I was using. Now, F124 and WRC are just generic profiles which come with SimTools. Now, they don't have any configuration for this specific setup, so they don't really understand what each actuator is doing or what it's assigned to, what function it's assigned to on the rig essentially. So that means that there will be some pretty heavy tweaking and adjustment and configuration that's necessary to get these working properly. Now, I was able to get something reasonably okay out of F124. WRC honestly was a bit of a dog's breakfast for me. I was never really able to get this dialed in to anything that was really acceptable to me. Having said that, hopefully by the time you guys are watching this video, Prosimu will actually have a special profile specifically for WRC built into their repository, which should work absolutely fine. So we'll come back and test that and let you know in the comments down below what it's like. But for now, WRC really wasn't great. Obviously, if you have a lot more talent than I do and a lot more time to really kind of dial things in and really fine tune, then I'm sure you could get it working well. Maybe there's some people out there that can share profiles down in the comments below if you've got them or where we can find them. But yeah, I want to try and keep this as representative of what the typical user experience is like out of the box and what you can expect to face if you buy one of these things, rather than sort of getting bogged down in all the details around fine tuning. But yeah, F124 and WRC were both just generic profiles, whereas AC, ACC, and iRacing are all specifically made profiles by the team at Prosimu for this rig specifically. So just to give you a better understanding of this, if we click on Plugin Manager down here, we can see at the moment we have the Prosimu T1000 series repo selected. So these are all of the profiles that have been pre-made specifically for this particular rig by Prosimu. If we change repos over to SimTools and click on Computer, you can see these are all the profiles that exist just for SimTools in general for all of these games, then you'd have to fine tune these to actually suit this particular rig. So yeah, I think the most important thing for you guys to understand here that might be interested in buying one of these is that SimTools, although they have done a good job of integrating these profiles into it, it is a more generic, I guess you could say, piece of software, kind of more like SimHub, for example, as opposed to something that's been specifically developed with only the features you need for the specific rig that you're going to be using it on. So as long as you're comfortable with that, look, I think the software is relatively well presented. I don't really have any issues with it, but it just can be, I guess, a little bit more clunky because of that reason. So let's just quickly go back to one of these profiles. We'll open up the iRacing profile, for example, and you can see here there's a bunch of stuff that you can do here. You can assign different functions to different axes, and you can kind of see how this ties in with what I was saying about, you know, it doesn't know unless you tell it what actuator is trying to do what. So you can imagine how you could assign this to do all kinds of funky stuff. And I mean, I've even seen people use this software to drive things like windscreen motors for hexapod systems and, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff. So it's a really powerful system. But you can see if we click on max min tuning now, this gives us the ability here to fine tune the various different effects. One thing that we will get into in just a minute is that there is an engine vibration, and I'll discuss the reason why in just a moment. Don't let me forget about that. But yeah, you can fine tune all the various different options here and, you know, get things dialed into how you like them. You can also increase or decrease the overall profile intensity down here as well. So once you've got the feeling dialed in, you can amplify or attenuate accordingly, depending on your personal preference and the type of car or track that you might be driving. So that's a quick rundown on the software. And if you do have any specific questions, again, let us know in the comments down below. There's quite a few very detailed videos from various different content creators and just the general sim racing community on YouTube as well, where they've run you through some of their settings. So I would definitely recommend, you know, rather than me spending an hour going through my personal preference, which doesn't really have a lot of value to you, just jump in the various communities and that'll give you a really good understanding of how all this works and some of the things that you can do with it. But that's what the software looks like at a top level at least. So that's what you're going to be dealing with day to day if you're driving the rig. Now, this does auto detect the various different sims as you open them up as well. There are a few exceptions to that. So occasionally you might need to just load the profile for the game that you're running, but in most cases we didn't have any issues at all. Once you've got this all set up, it is pretty much just set and forget. As long as it's running in the background, you just have it launch with Windows and it just does its thing, and it is all very simple. So let's get rid of that now and let's talk about the actual driving experience. Now, there are a few surprises here. If you guys have watched my previous motion system reviews, you'd see that for me personally, I'm not a massive fan of traction loss. I just don't feel like it adds a lot to the overall experience, and it can actually result in the rig feeling kind of disconnected from reality. And if you go back and watch my review that I did of the Next Level Racing Traction Plus, which has sway, so it has front and rear movement rather than just rear, you'll see that while it did work quite well in certain scenarios, it does just kind of give this overall sensation of floatiness, and there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'll explore in just a moment. But then when we've tested something like the QRS V20 from Qubic Systems, that's a completely different style of actuator system, and that tends to feel a little bit more connected than what I experienced with the sort of sliding system that we had on the Next Level Racing. And I would say this is kind of somewhere in between, because it doesn't move quite to the same extremes as the Next Level Racing rig did. The traction loss doesn't feel as kind of floaty in the first instance as it did in that particular rig, but it still has some of the inherent, I wouldn't say flaws, but some of the inherent limitations, I guess. So what I perceive when I'm driving in this rig immediately is just how fast and responsive things are overall, and that means it is really important to get things really well dialed in. Otherwise it does feel pretty ridiculous. It does really sort of throw you around like crazy. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't any engine vibration, which is one thing that I do really miss. Look, I mean, you can easily replicate that with some sort of a butt kicker or haptic feedback system, and those aren't super expensive these days. So if you factor that into the overall equation, it may or may not be a deal breaker for you. But yeah, for me, that is an important part of the experience of using a motion/haptic feedback system. This does do a very good job of granular detail in things like road textures, curbs, grass, all those kinds of things, rubbing against other cars. But yeah, actual engine vibration isn't there. Now, it might sound silly, but one of my favorite effects in any motion system or haptic feedback system is the sensation of gear changes, where it kind of clunks you forward and back. And that is really well represented in this system as well. So it became very evident very quickly that the sheer speed and responsiveness of these actuators does definitely, sort of lean more towards the high end and probably I would say punches above its weight in terms of price point here compared to a lot of the other systems that we have tested over the years. So definitely a strength for the system overall is that granularity and that detail, and you do get a really good sense of what the car's doing underneath you. It almost feels second nature. I didn't notice any sort of lag or latency or anything like that. Driving in VR as well, it didn't have any issues, even though the software doesn't have motion tracking built into it inherently. I didn't find that I was drifting and losing tracking or anything crazy like that. Everything just kind of gelled and worked quite nicely, and it did all feel quite intuitive. And I did test it across a wide variety of different driving styles, from GT3, open wheelers, F1, all the way through to rally cars and dirt tracks in iRacing as well. I did mention before, we did have a few issues with WRC not really working properly, but hopefully that will be sorted by the time you guys are watching this video. But yeah, look, across the board, the sensation of, you know, simulation of what the car's doing relative to the road, so the suspension movement, tire interface, all those details were really, really great. Traction loss is still, look, honestly, I'm just still on the fence about it. What I found with this particular rig is that when it was doing what it was designed to do, I didn't really even notice it. And, you know, I guess you could argue that the fact that you're not noticing it means that you're at one with the car and everything's working the way it's meant to work. But in saying that, it's not really helping me either, because it's not giving me a sensation. I don't feel in my body the sensation of the car sliding forward or moving around underneath me in that sense. I feel the body roll and, you know, vibration and the movement, but the actual traction loss effect, I just don't feel like it adds any real benefit for me. The only time I actually notice that the rig is moving from side to side under traction loss conditions is if I actually look at the ground, or when it actually returns back to center. And this is where things get a little bit complicated. And if you've seen that review that we did on the Traction Plus system from Next Level Racing, you'll know what I'm about to say here. Now, as I said before, it isn't as profound on this as it was on that particular system, simply because the scale of movement isn't as big on this as it was on that. But with a traction loss system like this, there's some really clever things that have to happen in the algorithm so that it doesn't just feel like it's floating all over the place. You can imagine as you start a slide, obviously the traction platform is going to simulate the slip angle of the car, and that all works absolutely fine. But what happens when you return back to zero? If you slowly kind of ease out of that drift and you don't kind of snap it back again, as is often the case, what's going to happen is the motion platform can't just kind of sit where it was. It has to return to center to be able to simulate the next movement. And what that means is that if you are driving in a straight line, the rig still has to recenter itself. So you get this little moment of disconnect where the rig feels like it's kind of just drifting underneath you. And look, honestly, when I'm driving with this thing, the only time I actually notice that the traction loss is even doing anything at all is under those kinds of conditions where it actually gives me a sense of disconnect and is actually detrimental to the driving experience rather than beneficial. Now, I did experiment quite extensively with this over a number of days, and you know, I tried turning the effect down to see if it would get rid of that sensation of floatiness. Inversely as well, I also tried cranking the effect right up to see whether it did give me more of a sensation of the car moving around, as we were discussing before. And what I found is that when I cranked it up, yeah, I mean, it did feel like it was lurching around a bit more, but it still didn't really communicate the car sliding underneath me any more than what was already being communicated through the steering wheel. I think that, you know, anybody that's done drifting on a direct drive or any sort of force feedback wheel would know that, you know, the wheel rotates to the point where it's drifting and you can kind of just catch the slide intuitively. So you feel what's going on with the car through the wheel rather than through the seat of the pants as you would in the real world. And I just don't feel like this kind of style of traction loss system really gives you that same seat of pants feeling that you have in a real car, because the G-forces and the sustained G-force just can't really be there to simulate that. And then you have that disconnection of when you have to drift back to the middle as well. So yeah, when I cranked up the effect, it didn't really give me what I was hoping for, but it also, I guess, exacerbated and amplified those detrimental aspects of it as well. So look, I do think that it is a very subjective thing, and I don't want to say that it's inherently a bad system or anything like that. I think that the rig is really well designed, and I think overall it does a very good job of what it's looking to achieve. I'm just not certain that traction loss as a general concept is right for me. And yeah, look, I'd be really interested to hear from you guys that have experienced it for yourselves, what you guys think. Yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of a polarizer, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that strongly disagree with my opinion here. But look, at the end of the day, it is just my opinion. I would absolutely love to drive the 4 actuator or 5 or even 7 actuator versions of this to see what all those extra effects really bring to the table. But yeah, as it stands for me right now, subjectively, with the things that I look for out of a sim rig, I couldn't justify the cost of this over a similarly priced 4 actuator system that gives you pitch, roll, and heave. I feel like for me, that heave effect that's missing to an extent here is more important to me personally than the traction loss. So I would say this particular system isn't for me, but it is very well designed, and I would absolutely love to test some of their other configurations to see whether I feel differently about them. But you might absolutely love it. And what I would recommend is if you are looking at forking out this kind of money, you know, talk to some other people, get some other opinions. At the end of the day, this is just my opinion, and it is a very subjective opinion at that as well. It's just not something that I particularly look for in a sim rig. Other people might feel completely differently. If you can, get on a rig yourself, get on a traction loss system and see how you feel about it. And look, I have been quite vocal about this in the past. We had that Next Level Racing traction loss system here for quite some time. I ran it on my daily driver rig for, I want to say, about 6 months. I did that whole Porsche Super Cup series with it. And, you know, I ran it, I tried really hard with it. And at the end of the day, you know, they would have let me keep that system and, you know, run it on my rig forever. But I actually did end up sending it back to Next Level Racing just because I couldn't justify having it on my rig. I just didn't enjoy the experience with it. So look, I guess you could say I did go into this kind of expecting a similar experience, but I wanted to give it a red hot go as well. I wanted to really give this a chance to surprise me. And yeah, at the end of the day, that traction loss aspect of this just does leave me with a similar kind of feeling to that previous system. Whereas the QS V20, although it is, you know, massively more expensive than something like this, I do feel like the motion in that all kind of just comes together a little bit better for me. And we'll unpack that in more detail when we get into the full review of that rig in the not too distant future. So traction loss aside, what about the whole 2 actuator and a pivot bar versus 4 or 3 actuator system? So we kind of touched on it a few times throughout today's video. Look, it does lack that kind of pit of your stomach feeling, like dipping down into a rouge or, you know, going up a really fast crest, but it does still give a sensation of overall movement, acceleration, braking, and so forth, just because of the way it's able to pitch and roll. And that will depend on your seating position relative to the bar as well. You can see the bar is pretty much directly underneath my butt at the moment. If it were further back or further forward, obviously that is going to have an impact on the feeling overall. But yeah, those finer details like running up on an aggressive curb or even just track detail that are communicated through the suspension, I would say those kind of effects are still communicated very well with this. But yeah, I would say that the effects that I felt I needed to feel to drive quickly and consistently were there, but there was just a little bit of immersion missing by not having that heave effect compared to what I'm used to on my daily driver rig. Ultimately, my conclusion is it's a really well designed, really well built rig. Software side of things is all nice and clean as well. I think there's a lot of potential in there for growth as well with additional profiles over time. And yeah, look, I think if you go into this knowing that you want a traction loss system, you're absolutely going to love it and you're going to think it's fantastic and the best thing ever. But I think if you aren't sure whether traction loss is for you or not, you definitely want to try it out before you spend this kind of money. And I think it's as simple as that, guys. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on some of those other reviews that we've been talking about. We've got a bunch of really exciting stuff coming up soon. We've got the Samsung 57-inch review coming up. We've got a comparison with big triple screens as well coming up for that too. We've got the Pimax Crystal Light headset review coming up. We've got a ton of wheels to review. Yeah, we need to get back to work. So I'll see you guys again soon. Thanks for watching and yeah, have a good day. Bye.